So yes, I was asked to be relatively quick, so I will be quite short. And what I want to discuss, or what I want to talk about shortly in relation to this project, but not really so much the project itself, but taking a bit of a wider view, is how to look into some roles or some functions of artistic projects of this kind within the understanding of sustainability, sustainable development, and how the city relates to a search process for sustainable development. And especially within that search process, how this kind of collaboration between scientific approaches and artistic approaches can be interesting, and especially can be actually not only interesting but necessary or essential even. So first of all, quickly about sustainability, because this is something which is discussed quite often, but often under very different perspectives and with very different understandings, so it can be sometimes a bit confusing or partial. So sustainability has to do with dealing with several dimensions or several levels of reality. If you followed the discourses on sustainability, you will be aware of at least three of them: the ecological, the social, and the economic dimensions. However, one should also take into account the cultural and the personal dimension. I will very shortly say a few words about each of these, maybe trying to link that to the red triangle very shortly, but of course this is very drafty and I'm not a specialist of a place here, so it might not make sense. But for example, when you think about the social dimension of sustainability, you could see some of it through the mental maps. These are the different social groups, the different people from different social categories who are relevant to this space and connecting or not connecting to each other. So social dimension of sustainability can also have to do with all sorts of social issues, questions of social justice, which are raised. You probably all, or many of you who are from social sciences, know about questions like gentrification, etc. This is part of the social dimension. This is also where it connects to the economic dimension of sustainability, where you look at the different economies. This was also already mentioned earlier today, the different economies which are being developed or which are allowed to further develop in a part of a city. So the creative economy, the industrial economy, post-industrial, etc., and how they relate to each other, and how different forms of economic life can allow well-being, not necessarily always profit or growth, but well-being, or forms of well-being. Well-being is also something connected to the personal dimension of sustainability, having to do with self-development, with self-realization. How far can different people self-realize in a part of a city, like for example the red triangle, and how do the different personal self-realizations of people connect to each other or not? Another one is of course, and this is a basis for everything else, is the ecological dimension of sustainability, which can have to do here a lot with, former industrial site. I have no clue, but I imagine there's quite a lot of stuff in the earth in there, which might be quite interesting to look into. The canal right there is also quite interestingly, I was told, used as a dump site. But of course the ecological dimension also has long-term perspectives. One could think about the sea level rise in St. Petersburg and imagine something I was thinking about while doing the game with the others, this district as some kind of vision of Peter, with gondolas and the water rising and people being able maybe to navigate between the buildings. Anyway, so the ecological dimension, as you can see, has also many different aspects. And of course, the cultural dimension has to do with a kind of cultural vitality, which is present in different parts of the city. As you could see here through the creative sector, which is active, the cultural dimension is also important and being developed in this district. So when one thinks about urban sustainability, seeing all those different dimensions coming together, this is something which has to do with understanding complexity, with living and seeing complexity, and understanding that there are several pathways to a sustainable urban development. There's no single pathway. There's no single solution, and especially there are no simple solutions. Usually, simple solutions for urban development are catastrophic. One keyword which I often use and which I only shortly want to mention here is that urban sustainability, or sustainability of any system actually across ecological and social systems, often it benefits from having some level of resilience. Yeah, resilience, which I won't have time to discuss this in detail here either, but this has to do with the possibility to both adapt and resist changes, while having a certain desirable development pathways. Different groups of people have different desires for the future, which they think is worth striving for, and they also have to adapt to each other. So there's a kind of mix of adaptation and resistance which is necessary for resilience. Resilience is often developed with different qualities. I will mention three qualities shortly. One of them is diversity, that there are many different forms of culture and forms of life that develop and that can accommodate with each other. Another quality is redundancy, or redundance, which has to do with the fact that a resilient system, in this case a resilient neighborhood, or a neighborhood as part of a resilient city, should allow multiple ways to do the same thing, should allow for the urban society to achieve its desires in multiple ways, which are existing next to each other and in parallel to each other, and not to have one efficient solution. Because when you have a one efficient solution to your desire as an urban society, when things change and when you're great, one efficient solution fails, well, then everything fails. When you have redundancy, this doesn't happen because you have multiple ways to address your issues. So that's the second aspect. And the third one, which is also connected to redundancy and diversity, is self-organization. So that there is a level of capacity to self-organize within parts of a system. So within, for example, parts of a neighborhood or a specific area, such as the one you're looking at. Another thing which is typical of sustainability is that this is oriented to futures. This is a thinking which is not only a kind of short-term, immediate thinking, running after immediate solutions to immediate problems, but thinking about the future, or rather even thinking about futures with an S. I mean futures in the plural. Because once again, there is not one pathway to multiple futures. So sustainability has to do with thinking along three axes. One of them is this time axis, looking back into historical heritage, and today we could very well, thanks to the first speaker, have this background, which is essential and very important, but also thinking in a futures-oriented way, which is part of what the game was about, thinking about the futures. So that's the first axis. A second axis, however, is to think about different spaces. And here, one important dimension one important thing not to lose out of the picture or out of the mind is that when one looks at one district, specific space, one should also think about other spaces. For example, the whole city, or the relationship to wider national, regional, continental or global level. Sustainability is not something that can be thought independently for one specific space. It always has to relate one space to actually the rest of the planet. And finally, one cannot think of sustainability without a third axis, which I would call an axis of otherness, like the other. And this has to do with the capacity to bridge with other groups, whether this is other subcultures or other professional groups. In this case, as we could see in the mental maps, the designers who might need some help to connect to the others, to all the musicians, all the workers who seem to have more of this picture. So the otherness is, of course, different subgroups within society, but it's also within, otherness of other cultural backgrounds, intercultural otherness, or also otherness of other species. We encountered a dead rat, for example, but I'm not going to go into that.
It became the star, actually.
Yes, it became a landmark.
The dead rat.
The dead rat was a short-lived landmark, if we think in the categories of Lynch, which are of course a bit restricted, but the thing that fits for him is landmark then. Thinking about urban sustainability requires to work in an interdisciplinary and in a transdisciplinary way. This means that one has to combine different forms of expertise and different competencies. Besides the different disciplines, which I'm not going to list, there's millions of them nowadays, there are specific competencies that are necessary and that are described by sustainability science researchers, especially like Arnim Vik and his colleagues. They talk about 3 categories of competencies which are quite important. One of them is dealing with, well, what I would call complexity. They talk about systems, but it's about complexity, understanding this multidimensional world. Another one is about collaboration, because one has to be able to work with each other when one has all those different forms of knowing and working and acting in society. So one needs to be able to collaborate. And finally, one of their big categories of competence is foresight, the capacity to imagine futures, the capacity to work with pictures of the future and to work with visions. So unlike what this terrible quote we have, not we, but they have in Germany, which is like, if you have visions, go to the doctor, which one, Chancellor of Germany said what? Yes. Oh, President. Okay. It wasn't Schmidt? Ah, okay. Anyway, you will tell me later. I will need historical correction from the Goethe Institute. So this means, this kind of transdisciplinary need means that we need to work integrating different forms of knowing and researching, such as, of course, the social scientific one. This one I don't need to tell you much about it. I guess many of you are connected to this university in St. Petersburg and know about the quality and the value of social science, that it is useful to society, so this I don't need to argue for. But another one which is especially interesting and important and valuable is forms of artistic research, and that's what I will talk a bit more about now. And the third one, which is very important, I won't talk a bit about it now, but I just want to mention it because it's also important, is natural science research, which is also essential for looking into sustainable development, also in a city. So, why integrate the arts? Why work with artistic research? As those of you who did the game over the weekend or have already experimented with arts-based or artistic research already know, what I'm going to say will sound obvious. For the others, it might be maybe of some interest and not sound as obvious in case you never thought about it. But so, excuse me for the obviousness if some of what I say is or especially you, because I think it will be quite obvious. So one of the qualities of artist research is that it is open-ended, and that it allows to develop something which has a beautiful word in English. I don't know if you have a word in Russian, which is serendipity.
I don't know what it is.
Serendipity. Serendipity. Does anybody know serendipity in German? In
checked once,
Russian?
I forgot.
Yes, I think it's прозорливость.
Maybe.
So it's in short, it's from the story of the 3 princes of Serendip. It's an old Persian story about 3 princes in India who just are expelled from their kingdom, which was Sri Lanka actually, and who are so attentive to things around them that they discover things that they did not look for. They have a special wisdom, a special sagacity of seeing things that they are not looking for, and then being able to find solutions or to react to events thanks to this great sensibility. So serendipity is something that is very well developed through different forms of artistic processes and artistic research. Another thing which is interesting with artistic research is that it is open to the materiality, opening up especially to material details, and also valuing abduction, so valuing working with single cases, which you also have with designers, but you also have it strongly in artistic forms of processes and research. Another quality which is interesting in artistic research is that you have a variable combination of two qualities, which are playfulness and critical inquiry or critical reflexivity. And in different forms of artistic processes and search processes, you have different balance or different quality of playfulness associated with critical reflexivity. Of course, in the case of games and playful game design, the quality of playfulness is quite obvious. I don't need to go into details to demonstrate that. Another one that, another quality that you already mentioned quite clearly, that Yosha mentioned just a few minutes ago, is the quality of using fiction. Using fiction as a kind of exploratory and imaginative approach to reality, which is a very, very useful way to work. And also many social scientists are aware of it and often praise, for example, literary authors or artists for that. It's really not something very new. Even economists like Thomas Piketty in his whole book talks a lot about the fantastic work of literary authors. Another interesting, or generally something which is nice with artistic research, and which I think is a main quality, is to make the questions we have more interesting. So this is not about finding quick answers to our problems, but rather about enriching the questions. This is something that I would relate, or rather that already Gregory Bateson mentioned several decades ago, which is that modern society thinks too much in terms of shortcuts, and arts can help us to go away from taking those shortcuts in our thinking, which, however, too often in other areas of society we tend to continue taking. So to try to go away a bit from these shortcuts and this efficiency obsession or obsession of control that we have in other areas of knowledge. So another thing, I won't go into details, but that's what my theoretical work is on, is to try to understand how the arts can develop aesthetics of complexity. Artistic processes can develop different kinds of aesthetics. Some aesthetics can be more valuable than others, I think, for the question of sustainable development, and especially aesthetics of complexity are the more valuable kind. Here, I mean aesthetics that especially value and make people aware and capable of working with things like ambiguities, ambivalencies, and working or thinking and sensing not only dichotomies like black versus white, or dichotomies with scales like black, gray, and white, but rather dualities where things include each other, like in this beautiful Chinese image of a yin and the yang, this kind of Chinese thinking. So this is a kind of sensibility that one finds for especially non-European philosophies, but also that one can find through certain forms of artistic practice. This sensibility to complexity is something that an author I like a lot, a French sociologist, philosopher, and polymath, as one used to say, Edgar Morin, talks about, which is, when he talks about a sensibility to complexity, he talks about a musical ear. He says that people who have a sensibility to complexity have something like a musical ear, where you don't just hear one line of music, like one melody only, and then all around is only noise, but actually you can hear several melodies, you can hear overlaps, you can hear tensions and conflicts, and you can hear harmony at the same time as disharmony. And still consider that as one ensemble, one dynamic and tense ensemble, a musical piece. Which of course is the case for a symphonic piece of music, but could even be the case for a most famous German rock band, Rammstein, if you listen to Rammstein properly. Or let's say Leibach, to have something a bit more culturally dear to the cultural elites. So, what is important to sustainable development or to the search process of sustainability is to be able to develop the imagination of desirable futures and also of undesirable futures. And this definitely needs imaginative and creative approaches. This is where one has to separate or to be able to distinguish between different forms of creativity which are needed, because very often we hear about developing individual creativity, especially in terms of urban development or urban policies. One can think about things like, you know, this kind of idea of an individual creativity of artists or specialized creative professionals, a kind of human capital, which is especially good for the economy. Keyword Richard Florida and so on. I mean, this kind of development. This is something that I would consider as especially unsustainable development, but I won't have time to engage now into a critique of Florida and how it's destroying cities around the world and destroying societies. But in short, the kind of creativity which is meant here is, of course, to a part an individual creativity, but also a social creativity. So a social creativity which combines the creativity of the individual and the creativity of a group. Like, for example, you can have in a well-working jazz ensemble which is doing a jam session and developing its creativity. Or in a well-working game session where some of the creativity is maybe trained at an individual level and some of it is maybe trained as a kind of group process which can then engage in interesting directions. So then, very short because we're already late and I already talked longer than I wanted. What about the game at the red triangle? I won't make an evaluation scheme or anything like that, but still point at a few things I already mentioned and relate them to the experience of the game that we had together on Sunday and preparing it on Saturday, etc. I talked about imagination, about foresight. Of course, this game is very interesting from this perspective because this game was about, imagining 2030, imagining the future of or possible futures. Again, several futures of this site. So imagination, foresight was part of the focus. And some of the question would be how far imagination was realized for different participants, how far imagination was stimulated. Another one is complexity. How were there elements of ambiguity, of ambivalence that were valued and used productively? How far were multiple stories and voices coming together and in an interesting way? Another aspect is collaboration that I mentioned. Of course, I won't have time for this in detail again here, but there are differences between participation and collaboration. We were talking about it with Sebastian, Yosha's colleague, a couple of days ago, where certain forms of gaming can especially develop participation, which is an interesting quality. But there's also further qualities which are qualities of collaboration, which would require other kinds of work and development. One thing which is also very interesting is how some of the participants in the game could start developing their own game routes, after playing the game and using the game, also becoming, so to say, productive of further